Order, order. Welcome to this morning's evidence session. This is the first oral evidence session of our new inquiry into the licensing of taxis and private hire vehicles. We'll be hosting two panels today. During our first panel, we'll be hearing from representatives of the workforce and unions about how the current licensing system affects drivers' safety and working conditions. And during our second panel, we'll be scrutinising licensing authorities on how regulation can vary between different licensing authorities across England and considering what impacts that may have on passenger safety and enforcement. So could I ask the first panel of witnesses to please introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I'm David Lowry. I'm the Director of the National Private Hire and Taxi Association, and I'm here to give evidence on behalf of our membership. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair. My name is Paul James from the Unite the Union Taxi Section. I'm also the Project Manager for Unite Taxi Education.
Good morning. I'm Andy Mahoney, representing the Licensed Private Hire Car Association. I also operate a schools transport business with just over 4,500 vehicles nationally and licensed with 40 different licensing offices.
Good morning, Eamon Ahern, GMB National Officer. I represent our members who work in the traditional private hire and also platform economy.
Welcome to our committee. So I'm going to open with a fairly general question on the legislative framework. So the taxi and private hire licensing system has largely been governed by provisions of quite old legislation, acts passed in 1847 and 1976. Is this legislation fit for purpose of modern times? David?
I'm not entirely sure that the 1847 Act is fit for modern times, but the 1976 Act most certainly is. More importantly, there was a section of the 76 Act that whoever wrote the 76 Act had incredible foresight when including it. And that is specifically section 75(1)(a) of the Act, which stipulates that once a private hire driver is cleared outside of their district, they would not be available to receive a further booking until they cross back into their licensed district. Now, 50 years ago, all private hire companies and drivers were governed by the range of the CB radios or taxi radios that they were using. So once they'd left their district, they wouldn't be able to, they'd be out of range and wouldn't receive a signal anyway. However, nowadays, with the app-based systems, that's no longer the case. So where it wasn't needed to be enforced 50 years ago, now it actually is.
Chair, Unite firmly believe that the framework's broken and it needs fixing. We believe that successive governments have let the trade down, the profession of taxi and private hire down immensely, by not ever implement any recommendations from the Transport Select Committee in 2011, the Task and Finishing Group report, and also the Law Commission. We firmly believe that with the Casey report coming up over child sexual exploitation, that this government must enforce the law to protect the travelling public and also the drivers.
We're going to come on to both those points in the session, but thank you. Andy?
Thank you, Chair. I believe that local authorities really struggle to regulate effectively. There's about 270 different licensing offices throughout the country that probably operate with about 230 different sets of conditions. Over 300,000 licensed drivers that operate to different conditions. Most taxi authorities or licensing authorities would have around 10 council officers in the committee. That's about 2,700 officers making the rules. And that is probably why we're in such a mess, quite honestly. The solution has got to be one single, absolute national standard for licensing and for enforcement. And that way, everybody works on the same level. Enforcement can be done throughout the country. Maybe having to do it with PCNs if a driver's doing something wrong, so that a licensing office gets paid, but that's what I believe should happen.
Thank you. Eamon.
Thank you. I won't repeat what other colleagues have said, other than to say I don't think 50 years ago the concept of integrated transport networks like we pursue today was really on the agenda. With all the concerns around environment and traffic and sustainability, I think they just weren't concepts at that time. So by virtue of the fact that this legislation and the framework is so old, I think it does require a revision precisely to pick up some of those more modern elements that we're talking about, not least around platform working and the like. And I think from the G&B's point of view, the framework almost without comparison that I can feel applies to parties in such an unequal way. And I think if we were reframing the industry, we would ensure that there was a significant driver voice, because I can't conceive of another industry where one party is so silently treated in a framework which effectively governs their work. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting spread of responses, none of which contradicting each other, I don't think. Thank you. It's helpful. Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the fact that I'm a former employee of the G&B Union and chair of the G&B Parliamentary Group. The second question is also quite general. In your view, what are the biggest challenges facing taxi and private hire drivers in terms of their working conditions and well-being?
I think the biggest issue that they've got at the moment is the flooding of many regions. The problem with flooding of regions means that it allows for prices to be reduced because there are that many drivers available for each trip that is on offer. That means that the cost and the income for the drivers is massively reduced, which then means they have to work longer hours in order to comfortably maintain a living wage. What we believe is within the existing framework and legislation, you have the ability to regulate hackney carriage fares as to the maximum that they can charge. What we believe is that there should be a regulated minimum per mile charge that is applied to private hire that must be paid to the drivers. When we see price comparisons and competition, which is perfectly normal, in the likes of Asda, Tesco, Morrison's, where they have price wars with loaves of bread, milk, coffee, alcohol even, it isn't the cashiers, it isn't the employees of those supermarkets that are paying the cost of that price reduction. That's not what we see in the private hire sector. When there is a reduction and there is introductory offers and there is 50p a mile, 70p a mile, etc., in order to gain the customer base, it's the driver that's paying the cost for that. So we believe that that should be regulated, because when they're working longer hours, they're more tired, they're more stressed, they're more anxious, and they're wondering how they're going to pay their mortgage, feed their families. All of this increases the pressure on their mental anxiety and their well-being.
Lawrence, yeah, United Union, obviously we fight for drivers' rights and workers' rights and terms and conditions and good working and employment stability. We believe that the conditions for the workforces and large operators, the larger operator-based apps have manipulated the Deregulation Act of 2015, and they're just flooding areas, major cities, towns, airports like Gatwick, who have massive amounts of TfL drivers flooding there. We have drivers living in their vehicles over weekends, and I witnessed that on a weekly basis in Liverpool. But we also have reports from our members in Manchester Airport, Heathrow Airport, and also there's reports from the local villages around Heathrow about the amount of people, taxi drivers, that live in their vehicles. We do believe it has a massive impact on their mental health, and because they have to work excessive hours for very low pay, we do feel that it does lead some drivers into addiction as well, mainly gambling addiction, to try and supplement their income, and also the use of illicit substances to keep them awake for for long periods of time. We also feel that the turnover of drivers in the industry, which was once a very professional industry, but that has been watered down massively. The turnover drivers for people entering the trade, they can go and basically license shop, where they go to the easiest license authority to get a badge, where there is minimum standards. As I say, we run Unite Taxi Education. We strive for the highest standards within the Liverpool City region and Greater Manchester City region, where drivers have to do an accredited qualification to gain entry into the trade, so they know the full professional aspects of the trade. Majority of the new drivers coming into the trade are second income stream, so they are basically going to the easiest license, getting a license, doing a normal job, 9 to 5 or 12-hour shifts, or whatever it may be, and then going out and driving a taxi and private hire. As a union, we think this is very dangerous and would have a massive impact on the mental health of the drivers themselves and their family and their income stream.
Mr. Mahoney, would you?
Thank you. I believe that there's two distinct types of licence within private hire. One is the restricted school licences, which is for people that work solely in schools. They are mainly employed. My own business employs about 5,500 drivers on PAYE, which is a completely different model to most. The private hire side, there are certain barriers to coming in, and one of the biggest barriers is the time and the cost in some licensing offices. The price of a licence can be £350, £380. From that sort of range down to £79, and that is all because of the efficiency of the licensing office. A licensing district cannot make money out of licensing. So if they are acting within the rules, then they set their licences on their cost. So it's only because of inefficiencies. Some licensing offices take 8, 10, 15 weeks to license. That is far too long for somebody that needs an income to get an income. There's the reason for a lot of the licence shopping, and it's because of the inefficiencies of licensing offices. So once again, I'll say national standards takes away a lot of that perceived licence shopping, because there's I don't believe it's about easy for a lot of people to go on and get a licence with less standards. However, if that is the case, national standards, absolute standards, will stop that dead. Have a licensing regime that is administered maybe by DVLA, by the Traffic Commissioner. It can still go through the local licensing offices for them to do every bit that they do with enforcement and licensing drivers, but under one set of rules. And that way, I think you'll find that the costs will even out. There won't be any argument of whether it's easier to get licensed if it's less standards. Standards should all be the same. Every passenger in this country deserves the same standard of safety. Why would somebody be more safe in one area, council area, than in the neighbouring area? They shouldn't be. They should all be exactly the same, and that's the way it is with buses, coaches, and every other type of operation, really. So I think the other thing, we have this triple lock, which is a major concern to drivers. If you live in Surrey, for instance, and you're going to move to Hampshire, you can't hold two licences at once. So you have to apply for a new licence. You're a new driver, and they make you get a new DBS. You have to hand your old licence back, and you've applied for your new licence. Different set of rules. The car that you've always had is now no good for there. It's a completely different set of rules. So drivers are stuck. They, a lot of them can't move from area to area. And that's where I think a lot of the mental stress is. What Paul's talking about with drivers is something I've never witnessed in my life, and but I don't live in Liverpool.
Thanks, Lawrence. Without wanting again to repeat too much, I do think we have to agree that oversaturation is a key issue, and the impact that does have on earnings. And I think there's another element to that which I think complicates the matters, is that increasingly there is a lack of transparency in respect of the earnings that drivers achieve, and the platform industry in its widest sense often refers to the phrase, we provide more earnings opportunities. And I think it's a telling phrase because it doesn't suggest that hourly earnings are increasing, it suggests that we're providing more opportunities. And whilst that is welcome on one hand, there is the notion of a law of decreasing returns, and there is also the impact that this has potentially on the notion of flexibility, which again is one of the key elements that people who are proponents of the platform work talk and promote quite heavily. So there inevitably, we believe, is becoming a conflict around this, which I think colleagues referred to in terms of the increasing hours that drivers are meant to work. But fundamentally, a challenge for drivers is that if increasingly they're on platforms with no transparency over earnings, you are fundamentally insecure. And I think if we reflect back on the Make Work Pay document, Lawrence's massive contribution to that is the notion of security is inherent within the first 3 or 4 pages. It is referenced on multiple occasions, the security for workers, the security for communities, the security that gives people the ability to be active members of a community in a fully functioning sense. And if we accept that there's a growing driver population who don't have the same set of securities that the rest of an integrated transport framework has, it does seem a bit odd. We have all of these rules and regulations that are quite supportive of workers in the transport economy, but we have the Cinderella group over here, drivers who are almost an add-on, an ad hoc. However, everybody talks about the fact that they are vital to the nighttime economy, to members of the community who are disabled or vulnerable in terms of transport needs. So it does strike as a bit odd, and I think that is one of the challenges for drivers in not having that degree of framework, is that they're constantly fighting a battle to be heard. Their voice is very rarely engaged foremost in discussions around what they do, and often they have to refer back to licensing authorities, which other colleagues have mentioned have challenges of their own in terms of consistency. So I think that the challenges that face drivers there are a multitude, and ideally there's an opportunity here, especially with the potential devolution bill, to rectify some of the emissions that they experience as fundamental members of the transport network.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We may want to come back to the fee income saturation issue in a bit. Baggy, safeguarding.
Thank you, Chair. So the most recent national taxi and private hire driver survey has found that over half of drivers have experienced verbal or physical abuse. And from my conversation with drivers, I'm not surprised at that figure. I thought it might even be higher. Lots of actions have been discussed: CCTV, panic alarms, protective screens, links back to the police, cross-authority sharing of information. But what actions and policies do you guys feel would address the problem best?
So I've actually written several articles on this over many years, and they're still ongoing. We believe that it is a lot more than 50% of drivers that are subject to verbal, racial and violent physical attacks. The problem that we've got is drivers don't report it, because if they do report it, they know that there's a very slim possibility that the police will turn up. Because the police know that when they do turn up, it's a case of your word against theirs, and there's a lack of evidence in order for them to investigate. And if they do turn up, the passenger that's assaulted you has already gone. That means that there's nothing for them to investigate, and they've then got to try and chase it. And I was personally attacked in 2010, I gave the police the offender's name, his address, with the vehicle registration number of the vehicle he was in, his direction of travel, his estimated time of arrival at home. It took them 2 weeks to go and interview him. Because of that lack of enforcement, which doesn't just stop at the police, it carries on to the CPS, whether they decide to take the matter further and take it to court. It then continues into the courts, where somebody does appear in front of a magistrate, and they're let off with a slap on the wrist because they've got a drink problem. Well, that doesn't help the driver that's just been attacked and stabbed in the eye and stabbed in the head and stabbed 13 times with his ear hanging off. The type of attacks that drivers are up against on a daily basis. But because they know that there's going to be a lack of enforcement, lack of activity and lack of support, they've given up reporting it. So there needs to be far more active enforcement, which has been referred to here before. There also needs to be the presence of evidence-gathering technology, whether that be in-vehicle recording or whether it be in-app recording. Whichever way they do it, the police need to know that there is going to be evidence on which they can rely and prosecute. Because the flip side of that, of course, is if the offender reports the driver for even saying something inappropriate, that driver is going to find himself in front of a licensing committee, and this is what was referred to in the panel before about insecurity. They make the report to Uber deactivates, that driver's out of work. They make the report to the council, within a week or two or a month or two, they're called in front of a licensing committee and their licence is revoked or suspended, which means they can't work for any operator and they're out of work. So that security, that level of security within the industry and the feeling of protection is absolutely paramount.
Anybody else?
Thanks, Maggie. Yeah. So some of the mechanisms we can put in place to safeguard the drivers is set up regular local working groups with the combined authorities who will have ultimate oversight over the licensing authorities, the police and the trade bodies to come to formulate a plan for victim support against assault and abuse. Enhanced training for the new police officers on taxi and private hire legislation, so they are aware of the hardships and the problems that are inherent within the trade. Set up local emergency numbers, so a taxi and private hire driver can contact that number if they're in desperate need. Our colleagues in Unite colleagues in Dundee have just started a big campaign which Unite are going to try and roll out throughout the country, called No Excuse for Abuse. Now they've got, in conjunction with Dundee City Council and also Police Scotland, and they have a direct number and they quote that saying, and the police act on it straight away because they know that driver is in danger. We also think that the NR3 system could be enhanced for vehicle licensing, to track which vehicles have been suspended, revoked, etc., to stop them moving on to other authorities. And the LCRCA and the GMCA are in the process of now setting up task force of local licensing officers, local parking services, and also the police to combat what we've got, a pandemic of cross-border hiding.
Well, we'll come on to cross-border hiring. Anything else on this issue of driver safeguarding and safety of drivers?
Yeah, if I can. I think that anything that we do has got to be proportionate. Private hire is different to taxis. Taxis are held on the street. Nobody knows who's getting in that vehicle. Private hire has got the ability to take the full details, and should be taking the full details of every passenger. Maybe should take their credit card details as well, or prepayment. And I think that the driver safety aspect of it really depends on where in the country they are and what time of day. So rural economies, taking passengers to the supermarket maybe during the day, or the airport, very, very little ever happens with that. But nighttime economy is completely different. I heard what Paul said about police training. Absolutely right, that it can only happen with national standards, otherwise the police have got say 230 different sets of rules to look at. And as far as NR3 goes, I think that NR3 is absolutely right, but the operator often doesn't get information that they should do, and they should also be able to check the NR3 register as they can do in the equivalent of coach and bus regulations through the Traffic Commissioner.
Chair, very quickly, agree about the no excuse for abuse. If I walk into a train station now, I'm quite shown visibly that abuse will not be tolerated by other elements of an integrated transport network. I think the challenge for drivers is that there is no body that is necessarily responsible for them. Again, they fall through the cracks. There's no employment status that says there is an obligation on the employer to implement and institute safe practices of working, which you would get in the rest of the transport network. I think as well, we can't ignore racism. GMB members reported 60% last year were impacted by the race riots, and I imagine there's probably been similar instances this year. I think we can't ignore the fact that that issue runs parallel with many elements of the private hire industry, unfortunately, and I think we need to be cognizant of that and understand that element as well, given the demographics of the industry at large, and they all impact on safeguarding in terms of the driver safety, which I think is again a Cinderella element.
You would have thought that it's not licensing, but it's private sector, but you would have thought that the Uber as riders, as passengers, you get the passenger equivalent of the star system. You can be rated as a bad passenger. It doesn't sound like that's acting as a deterrent to unacceptable behaviour.
If I may, Chair, given that we represent Uber and have a relationship with them, that's an area of ongoing concern, I have to admit, because there is an issue whereby any complaint that is made, any issue that arises between a rider and a driver is deemed to be between those two. Uber is essentially hands-off. If there is any loss of earnings associated with false claims of against the driver, which everybody has the right to make a complaint, don't get me wrong, the loss of earnings that driver experiences is described as a civil matter, and drivers are advised to go pursue a rider in the civil courts. Obviously that's untenable, but that again comes back to this point that they are falling through the cracks in an otherwise integrated network. And if you were a bus driver and you suffered an assault or a verbal abuse, there would be a very clear pattern and a very clear pathway for which you could have some degree of resolution and support. But again, we've got hundreds of thousands of people working in our communities who have a significant gap in that area.
Okay, it's just that I was assuming that as an Uber passenger, it's probably the same for Bolt, etc., that it's in my interest to keep my rating high in order that when I next put out a call out for a cab, I'll be more likely to be accepted by a nearby driver because I'm a highly rated passenger, and that even if a driver has put in a complaint, they rate an abusive passenger with a very low rating, that would therefore, that's the incentive on the passenger. Somebody's shaking their heads at the back, sorry, I haven't done. But it's obviously not working in practice.
It doesn't actually work that way in reality. What we're seeing within the community and the industry is passengers are increasingly making allegations against drivers, whether they be false or accurate. They've identified it as being the new electronic form of doing a runner, which is the old term if somebody gets out and does a runner. But of course, as Emma just said, when a passenger used to get out of the vehicle and do a runner for the sake of a £10 fare, the driver's actually lost that £10 fare. But when an Uber passenger makes an allegation against the driver, that driver is instantly deactivated for a period of up to 2 to 3 months. So it costs him thousands and he's out of work. That's the way it actually works. when a driver rates a passenger, that doesn't seem to have any impact on the Uber platform itself. That passenger just puts another one and another one and another one, and they've got that many drivers. Doesn't matter.
Somebody will take the fare eventually.
Exactly. Okay. And that's how the fares are being dropped as well.
Right, okay. We'll move on to another area. Oh, sorry.
Chair, can I just quickly come in on that? Because as Dave mentioned, this additional runner or bilger, we have a massive problem with the police if they ever do arrive, the fact that they say it's a civil matter and not a criminal matter. There is legislation that says it is a criminal matter. If you make off without payment and gain services by deception, it's a criminal matter. And again, getting back to education of the police officers, this is a massive thing that we need to get across, because it is putting not only the drivers in danger, because the most thing that you're going to do when somebody does a runner is react and potentially get out your vehicle and follow them, because it's like a personal insult as well as robbing you. And when you get out, you're then putting your life at danger. And there have been many drivers who've been assaulted, stabbed, even killed. And that's something that we have to, and this government has to put a stop to as well.
Okay, thank you. We want to move on to another area of deterrence. Alex.
So looking now specifically at CCTV, what role do you think that in-vehicle CCTV can play in protecting both drivers and passengers? But we've also seen in the evidence that there are some barriers, and like everything else, it appears to be a bit of a postcode lottery. So what are the main barriers that are there?
The main barriers are lack of understanding, lack of education, and Chinese whispers. Because the industry see it as being Big Brother is watching me. And local authorities do not understand the technology, and invariably they don't necessarily understand the rules and regulations around that either by the ICO. This just happens to be my specialist subject because I'm also a director of a company that does that as well. What we're seeing is drivers that put it in on a voluntary basis. They tend to care more about it, they look after it because they have chosen to put it into their vehicles at their cost, and they've seen the benefit and advantage of having it, which is, as I referred to before, that lack of defence and lack of evidence. This is exactly what CCTV is for. There is no Big Brother is watching me because they should not be remotely accessible, and under UK GDPR regulations, data may only be accessed in the event of an allegation being made. So the data is secure and safe anyway. Furthermore, you've got the audio or the use of audio, which the ICO took action against Southampton Council for, and ruled that it must be switched. There's a very small minority of local authorities that have set that audio to be timed. We believe and have seen that that is dangerous because you have no way of understanding or knowing how long that trip and the associated abuse is going to last. So therefore it should either be constant audio or it should be full controlled switched audio. We've got a handful of councils as well that do not allow the visible monitor. That is a huge loss to CCTV systems because it means that there is no visible deterrent. Having a system without a monitor simply means that yes, you're going to record the event so that you've got evidence after the fact, but there is nothing there to discourage potential troublemakers from actually committing that offence. Whereas if you can activate that monitor and they can see themselves, there's nothing calms them down quicker. So I think it's more cost and lack of understanding that is the barrier for bringing people, for people having CCTV. But I do echo one of the written submissions that were put in, and we say it every single time. CCTV is there to protect the public, which includes the drivers. Council CCTV, street level CCTV, all the public CCTV is funded. This is for the same purpose and it absolutely must be funded.
Alex, yeah, I mean, Unite, Dave is the expert, so I'm not going to cut across him in any way, but we do encourage, and certainly at Unite Taxi Education, that all drivers have their own CCTV systems and have data controller's licence as well. If we were to go forward towards everybody having it in, we would want the drivers to, the vehicle owners to have it maybe as part of their licensing conditions, to have a recognised CCTV system in and a data controller licence, so they are the single person that can download that data. Obviously, on request from the police or licensed authorities, they will be able to do that. We are 100% supportive that this will become a deterrent for unsocial behaviour towards the drivers, and also protect the travelling public, mainly, you know, the most vulnerable in society, nighttime economy, young girls and guys who've been drugged, date raped excessively over the limit of alcohol. We've had many complaints where a reveller's got home early hours in the morning, the parents have had a little bit of a bit of a go at the child, and she's turned around and said, "Oh, the driver took me here, there, everywhere." Obviously, the parents then make a complaint to the police check. And when we've checked the CCTV footage from the city, that actually the time frame that the driver that took it was the actual time frame. The reveller was just trying to get out of being in trouble with their parents by blaming the taxi driver. But that mud sticks as well. And the driver would, as Dave said before, would be hauled in front of because of the inappropriate behaviour.
Can I just check? I think you said there that you thought there should be some kind of sort of recognised CCTV, because in quite a lot of our evidence we've got people saying that they don't want a concept of approved devices because they can be very costly to have to get a specific type.
I think what we said in our submission is we don't want the local councils to do, because it's very onerous on the local council. It costs money for the driver to get the CCTV downloaded, and also the time off the road, which is costing time and money. What we are saying is this, and Dave probably is more of an expert on it. I have what's called a Black View CCTV system in my LEVC black taxi, and that has got a cloud backup that can last as long as I leave it on the cloud. So it is a recognised system. I'd say Dave is probably more placed to say about the difference.
Okay, we'll briefly go back to David and then that way again.
Yeah. So yeah, recognised systems. What we're seeing is there's a lot of people that are going to Halfords, eBay, etc., and they're buying a simple dash cam. Dash cams are not UK GDPR compliant. They cannot record anything inside the vehicle at all. So yes, there is a cost barrier. Yes, there is a differentiation between what is approved, which means actually legally compliant, and as verified to be so, and what is not approved, which could be absolutely anything, and then you run the risk of that data falling into the wrong hands and being shared on YouTube and social media, and that's a huge problem. So yes, there has to be an absolute national standard, and we're pleased to see that there is a growing national standard, and I have actually sent you a copy of that. That's up to now, that has been approved and accepted by around 115 different local authorities around the UK. But I do echo what Paul has said. We welcome the new approach that's been taken by some of the newer councils that have gone down the Madry route, where they are the data controller. However, they do not access the data. It is a condition of the system supplier that they access the data on the council's behalf. Now that builds the confidence with the drivers, because it is about that lack of confidence, lack of trust, the cost, which shouldn't actually be there because that's part of UK GDPR compliance regulations. You're not allowed to charge a fee for the retrieval of data. And it just overcomes all of that, because we're a system supplier, we're not an enforcement team. We're simply going to provide the data that has been requested and nothing more. So that is a welcomed approach, but I do agree with what Paul said about having to go to the council is a barrier.
Thank you for that clarification. Andy.
Thank you. I agree with the vast majority of what's been said about CCTV. I think nighttime economy, as I said earlier on, is completely different to rural daytime. Concerns me slightly with private hire, that private hire should be private hire. It is private. Bankers, solicitors, footballers, children, like school children use it. There's a lot of concern about how secure it is. Will bankers and people that are making contracts and the rest of it travelling a long way together, will they actually not use a private hire vehicle because it's got a CCTV and just look for somebody else to pay that hasn't got? So all of that concerns me. It concerns me about schools with children being videoed. Let's not get into that realm. And so I think there's an awful lot of thought that has to be given to the whole thing, quite honestly. It's not an easy one.
Largely agree. I think as well, definitely about the barriers and the trust. I think there's a real area of work to be done there, particularly on who can access and hold and the cost, and there shouldn't be a cost associated with that. The one thing I would flag is, or two things quickly, is that again, in any other form of transport, you're on CCTV, I get on a bus, get on a train, that it's there, it's present. Obviously audio is the big difference, but if we think ahead, we are transitioning at some point to automated vehicles. They will need to have audio recording capacity. There will be a change in the market and in behaviours and acceptance because they will need to have that functionality. And perhaps if people are warned, and there is a wider issue around making people aware that audio is being recorded, that also might help moderate behaviours, because that is also a key area of dispute. And sometimes a reactive position on setting up audio misses the key moment that is the essential dispute sometimes between riders and drivers. So I think it's not beyond the realms of our possibility to have audio and to reassure people to the extent that it's being used and why.
Thank you. So now moving on to complaints systems. Some of you have already touched upon this already in the evidence that you've given. But overall, how effective are the current complaint systems for both drivers and passengers, particularly in circumstances where drivers work out of area? And I like muddling things up occasionally, otherwise David will have to go first the whole time. So let us this time start with Paul.
Licensing authorities, rightly so, have to take seriously any complaints. The big thing we have is, with cross-border hiring and the amount of out-of-town private hires plying a trade in cities and towns across the country, they may have a plate 10. Liverpool might have a plate 10. So the passenger who gets in who's intoxicated, and again it's mainly the nighttime economy, who's intoxicated just looks at plate 10. They're in Liverpool, they complain to Liverpool City Council about plate 10. But that plate actually could be a Wolverhampton, it could be in Liverpool lately we've had as far as Newcastle vehicles plying their trade in Liverpool, and we've also had vehicles as far south as Birmingham and Solihull plying their trade, apart from all the Greater Manchester and everybody else. So they all have their own specific plate numbers, so it becomes harder for the travelling public to realise and make complaints. They automatically think they're in Liverpool, make a complaint. That driver then has to, depending on the severity of the complaint, could be immediately suspended or revoked. They then have to prove that they're not guilty before somebody's proven that they are guilty. And again, the whole complaint system needs to be reformed so it's faster and efficient. The drivers have good representation, and also the councils err on the, give the drivers a chance. We've probably all experienced those reps and people who represent the drivers when they are in trouble or being accused of anything, that they're already in somebody's mind proven guilty because he's a taxi or a private hire driver. And unfortunately, that's the reality.
Thank you. Andy?
Thank you. Once again, I think there needs to be a national standard. We have licensing offices in their terms, conditions and rules about complaints. They say that complaints must be informed to the council. What is a complaint? Was it that there's a red car turned up when actually they wanted a white car, that we was 5 minutes late? What is a complaint? There needs to be a standard of what actually a complaint is, otherwise councils just get inundated with complaints. And it's very, very easy with electronics now to just say, any sniff of a complaint, send it straight to the council, and the council just get thousands of complaints and they get bogged down. And I'm sure that's what happens with a lot of councils, because operators don't want to be accused of not putting in a complaint. In saying that, complaints must be treated as an operator failure if it's not reported or not reported in time. Who determines the outcome of a complaint? And this changes all over the country. So it could be the licensing officer. It might have to go to a committee. That committee could be a committee of councillors that are not trained. Could take, and it has taken, 9 months to get a committee meeting. That's just not good enough. So there needs to be a national standard, a set of rules. What is a complaint and how would a complaint be dealt with? And customers need to know how to complain. So a national database, I think, would sort that. It's all down to stripping the licensing back, taking it right back to to zero, and coming back out with national standards right the way through the system.
I think there is clearly a role for a national standard. How that national standard is applied is probably perhaps the real question. If we are moving towards sort of more enhanced transport authorities, perhaps that's a better balance, because some people will criticise a national standard, not us necessarily, saying it's too unwieldy, it's not flexible enough. And perhaps the examples that we're giving are they're sometimes too localised. And something like a Greater Manchester Authority, a TfL level, should in theory be a right size to have an effective and efficient system, because we also don't want to create a hacker's paradise by having too many centralised databases. We can see the dangers in some of that, but having some degree of consistency is absolutely essential. And as well about how drivers are protected, I have to emphasise, Paul's point. There is feels like a lack of procedural fairness. The concept of natural justice does not apply to drivers. The reactive position to immediately suspend has significant consequences for drivers, and the threat of that as well contributes, I think, to colleagues' comments about mental health earlier. This is a really serious issue, and again, I struggle to think of workers who are so easily set aside from doing what they do day to day and earning on the basis of a complaint that can take, agree, far too long to be resolved at many levels. Thank you.
Thank you. And then back to David. And David, I know in your written evidence, you were talking about premature suspensions, and perhaps that the process might be too effective, perhaps. On the other hand, we've also in previous inquiries heard, for example, about drivers who would be unwilling to take assistance dogs, and I know from my own casework, there are cases where there's alleged dangerous behaviour by drivers and the passenger doesn't feel that much has happened yet. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that, and perhaps the overall theme that keeps coming up of speed, because it does seem that actually if some of these complaints were dealt with a bit quicker, that would help everybody all round.
I would tend to agree, but I'm also going to throw a curveball in this, because the majority of the responses that you've had have been focused on the passengers making the complaints. We've actually seen the introduction of signage on vehicles that say, in the event or should you wish to make a complaint, please contact this number, and it gives you a contact number for the council. We find that offensive and don't agree with it. It should be, should you wish to make a comment, because they might want to compliment the driver. And yes, there are a rare set of situations where it may be a complaint about a guide dog or an assistance dog. But quite often those are also false allegations, and we've recently represented a driver who was taken to court with an attempted prosecution for refusing to take an assistance dog. He didn't refuse. He said that the dog had to sit in the rear of the vehicle with the passenger. The allegation was that he'd said that the dog had to go in the boot. It was a Vauxhall Zephyr, but they don't have a boot. And it's this kind of false reporting, false allegation that I referred to before, and the speed and haste of resolving those and getting to the bottom of whether it's genuine, in which case we absolutely agree the driver should be prosecuted for that offence. Or if it's a false allegation, in which case that driver should not be penalised for too long. What we have seen in recent years is the development of taxi cop schemes in various regions, including Bristol, and that then develops a far better reporting and action system, because the taxi cop, before he became a taxi cop, his opinion of the industry was the same as the general public. We're all bad. Once he becomes a taxi cop and he actually sees that actually it's the opposite way around, he's far more responsive, supportive and engaging with the industry, and they love it. They report to him. The passengers report to him. He supports the enforcement of the taxi ranks, and he puts regular bulletins out to build the confidence and to put reports on as to what actions he's taken. And this includes taking action against out-of-town vehicles that sat on ranks. So I think the whole reporting scheme does need to be speeded up, it does need to be more efficient, and that does need to be down to national standards. But there needs to be far more support for the drivers as well.
Thank you. Very quickly, because we do need to move on.
Thank you, Chair. Suspensions through complaints. Some complaints can be very serious, and what a council should be doing, a licensing office should be doing, is suspending, hearing, and then perhaps revocating. They don't have the ability to revocate after a suspension, and many panels can take, as I said earlier on, months.
Okay. Thank you. We do need to move on. I'm just spotting the time. Steph.
Thank you. Just stepping back a bit into the question of operating models, I wonder if you had comments on how well the current legislation and operating model, or operating regulatory framework accommodates both what we might describe as the traditional taxi model. I appreciate many traditional taxi firms do use apps, but compared to the pure native digital app-based model, how well is the legislation and the regulation accommodating both?
I believe, as I referred to before, the legislation, including Section 75(1)(a) of the Miscellaneous Provisions Act 1976, is very efficient, but because it was unknown about and unnecessary 50 years ago, it hasn't been enforced for long enough. I think that there should be expansions in certain areas with the legislation, which includes the rolling out of intended use policies for private hire vehicles. At the moment, it can be adopted to hackney carriage vehicles, but not private hire, because the issue that we've got is predominant out-of-area use, which is the activity of drivers intentionally going to a different local authority, not because it's easier, and we hear that all the time, and that doesn't undermine public safety as such, which is another allegation that we've seen, nor is it around the Deregulation Act 2015, which is quite often blamed on. It is purely and simply because it is cheaper, faster and more efficient to obtain that licence, and they genuinely believe that with that licence they can work anywhere they want in the country. Now, if you introduce the intended use policy and expanded it onto private hire, that would end predominant out-of-area use. It wouldn't stop the ability of right to roam. It wouldn't undermine the ability of app-based and traditional private hire operations. But what it would do is stop the flooding of regional areas hundreds of miles away from local authorities. And that would then boost the income for the private hire drivers that have always been in that area. Doesn't mean that those that have gone to the other areas would be out of work, because they would simply apply to be licensed locally. And I think that our belief is that would then reinforce Section 75(1)(a) and adopt geofencing into private hire industry. And I think that would far better protect the industry as a whole without making major changes to the legislation, simply minor tweaks.
Thank you. Steph, I think slightly differ from what Dave said about an intended use policy, but technology is is virtually the same. Everybody uses, every operator now uses an app-based technology to dispatch their vehicles. It's not the system, it's the cross-border hiring. That's the problem. And Unite's stance is we feel that every licensed vehicle should either start or finish its journey in the area that it's licensed. Now that is black and white. Our problem with the intended use policy is Knowsley Council got took to court because they put a percentage on it. What does the word predominantly mean? Is it, what does predominantly mean? Most of the time, so all the other time you can do. That's just our concern. Start and finish is in black and white. I can get a job from Liverpool to Manchester, and I can be given a job by my operator to go to Stoke to bring them back to Liverpool. But I could only start or finish in the area that we are licensed. That would stop licensing shopping, because you can only work in the area that you're licensed. So if you want to work Liverpool but are licensed in Wolverhampton, you can't work in Liverpool. It would make it easier for enforcement, because straight away the enforcement office and the police would say, what's that vehicle doing in here? Because let's go and check it. Have you got a job? No. So you're illegally applying for hire. One of the massive things we've got now is because of the cross-border saturation, that drivers are being forced to illegally apply for hire, because they're not getting the jobs that they think they get, so they just pick up anyway. And that's putting the travelling public at a massive risk. It also opens the doors for the criminal fraternity to do child sex exploitation, to do county lines drug dealing, and also human trafficking. And it is a massive problem. We've all know about the Casey report and Chapter 7.
We're going to come on to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, just because you've both given different answers to the same problem, is the flooding a problem based upon the operating model, simply because the digital native operators are just broadly more available across the whole country?
That's the belief.
Yeah.
They think they can work, and we see it on social media all the time. Go and get a Wolverhampton licence, you can work anywhere you want. Well, I'm sorry, a private hire licence, doesn't matter which council you're licensed by, you have that same ability or you don't. It's as simple as that. We differ on the intended use and the start to finish, or it's commonly referred to as the ABBA rule, because we've seen it on several occasions where a passenger could book a track. You could live in one area, you could work in a different area, your parents could work in a different area, and you have your regular company that you always use. So imagine the scenario: if you've got your taxi to go to work, you've gone to work, then you get a call from your parents, they've had a fall, they've had an injury, they need you right now. You ring your local company and they say, sorry, I can't take you, it doesn't end in my area. Or if you've gone on a night out or an event and you've met with friends, you'd booked your return trip with your regular customer to go home, they've gone to take you in, they've come to pick you up, you've met with friends and they want to have a house party and it's not in your area. You've turned up and you've got to say, sorry, I can't take you, you've got to cancel it. That's why we believe that the ABBA rule wouldn't work at all. But there is merit in the fact that we need to do something.
Understood. Could I, forgive me, come on to Andy and Eamon on this broader point about whether the current regime accommodates both traditional and more digitally native operating models?
I have probably completely different views, but that's what it's about. I believe that the ABBA, A to B, B to A rule is totally unrealistic. Thousands of tonnes of carbon would be produced unnecessary because of empty legs. Government mandates lowering emissions through ESOS and things like that, flying in the face of government and meeting carbon zero. Prices have always been based on every industry, transport industry, on return legs as well. If you're getting full money to go one way and nothing to come back, you've got no flexibility to reduce your price, and congestion's increased. So cross-border licensing, I believe, is a symptom of considerable inefficiencies and inconsistencies by licensing authorities, rather than people looking for a cheaper route to licensing. People do look for a cheaper route to licensing, but the inconsistencies are what makes that happen. That's why national standards must be there. Again, if we don't have cross-border, then what's going to happen is the people that flood into an area will just be licensed with that area that they flood into. If they're licensing in Wolverhampton and they live in Liverpool, they'll license in Liverpool because they don't live in Wolverhampton and travel to Liverpool. That's not the way it is. They license out of area. A major part of taxis and private hire particularly, is in times of national emergency, large events, breakdowns, things like that. If you have the ABBA rule, you can't, and no out of area working, when there's a breakdown, you have a major problem, especially if that breakdown is with a special needs child, 7 o'clock on a Sunday night, taking them to a care home 150 miles away from home with...
So I think we'll take the point that there's going to be exceptions, rail replacement services in an emergency.
Yes, you've got rail replacement, you've got airport, you've got disasters, large events like Cheltenham. You need to have a large amount of private hire from out of area and from different regions because there's just not enough.
In a way that I think would have existed and still exists regardless of the operating model that we've seen emerge in the market since 2015, but I appreciate the points. Can I come on to Eamon in terms of this point about the different operating models and whether the frameworks cater for them both adequately?
I don't think it does. I think fundamentally if the framework is designed to give surety to riders and to drivers and to operators, there is a huge gap around transparency of fares. And the models at present are completely, opposite. As a colleague was mentioning, you used to have rate per mile quite clearly. It was designated, it was understood, it was transparent. And an increasing proportion of the private hire market does not have that transparency. In actual fact, drivers in many of the operators are explicitly prevented from talking to passengers about the fares that they have been offered for journeys. So that sort of model, sort of contributing to the arrangements, I think is increasingly making those arrangements untenable because we will continue to have this unfair competition, and that will drive some of the behaviours that we've already heard about, which is about people then trying to seek out better opportunities as they see them. In terms of the cross-bordering, again, I think if we are looking at cross-bordering purely from the current footprint of localised transport authorities, then there are massive issues. But if we are thinking to the future where we do have TfL, Greater Manchester, Greater West Midlands, we have more conurbations and larger transport authorities, then perhaps the monitoring and the work around cross-bordering is a little bit easier. And in actual fact, perhaps we should be looking to the very point that colleagues have made, which is almost all operators now have a digital footprint. Yeah. There's nothing stopping us in review saying to an operator, well, show us all the extent of the trips that your drivers made over the course of a period of time. And that could very well give us an indication of what is predominantly for an intended use, or clearly identify abuse of cross-bordering restrictions, whatever they may be. That digital footprint will be useful into the future if we decide in a mechanism, a way to use it for accountability, transparency and reassurance for riders and authorities.
Thank you. And just a very, very brief clarification before another chair's keen to move us on. You talk about price transparency, which is only ever applied to taxis. Of course, we've never had complete price or regulated pricing for private hire. But I think what you're saying is that the difference with the new operating models is they are preventing the driver from discussing price with the passenger, which is something which, of course, has always been the case previously with private hire, because ultimately the contract and the payment is made directly from the passenger to the driver.
I think there's a subtle difference between having the conversation and being able to have the conversation versus being explicitly prevented from having the conversation. Yeah. So whilst you're right, the previous contract would have been a contract, you would, in the course of conversation, it would not have been any harm to say, yeah, actually, this is what I get for this journey. Yeah. That ability does not exist at present because there is such a shroud of secrecy over the innovation across the entire platform economy, not just in the mobility side. Yeah. It is, I think, a real challenge to us as public policy makers, which is to what extent should we have some degree of understanding of what transpires under the bonnet, so to speak.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Ollie, we sort of jumped ahead onto cross-border Is there anything else that you wanted to ask, given we've already sort of started on that topic?
Well, if it's all right with you, Chair,
Yeah,
perhaps
sure.
just invite the panel just to say if, do you feel that the whole out of area and cross-border question has been adequately covered by what we've discussed so far, or do you have any particularly salient thoughts to add on that? Because it's clear from the written evidence that there's very, very strong views on that subject.
Do you mind if I quickly?
Yes, all right. Yes, all right. I should.
No, that's okay.
No,
You were
go
closer,
for it.
so I thought might.
No, go for it. Go for
The
it.
one thing we would add is that with the proposed introduction of AV, there is nothing at present around displacement or replacement, and we know through sharp experience with the steel industry, the phrase "just transition" looks great, but often doesn't have meaning. And why I raise that about the steel industry and others is that they are employees. They have rights and entitlements. We are potentially moving into a sphere where 200,000, 300,000 people who have no similar rights are going to face either displacement or replacement. If cross-bordering or the equivalent of capping was to occur, which is a sort of a logical extension of cross-bordering efforts, you may then have a mechanism for the phased introduction of AV that seeks to displace as little as possible and in the most sensitive manner possible existing drivers within a certain area, because AVs will be licensed at a local level at this point, and if that local level becomes the wider transport area, it does provide perhaps a mechanism for us to approach this impending introduction in a way that is cognizant of the communities who rely on the fact that their partner is a driver, but in a manner that doesn't stop the introduction of AV, but it would rely on some degree of cross-bordering and capping. And that might be a positive public intervention in order to manage this transition so that we don't have 100,000, 200,000 people cast out of jobs, without any security whatsoever. Thank you.
David, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think we need to be very clear here in understanding what we mean when we're talking about cross-border here, because the actual issue is predominant out-of-area use, which is drivers that are intentionally sitting around. They know they go to the airport without a booking to take them there, so they shouldn't be there at all, because private hire is pre-booked only. So unless you've got a pre-booking trip to justify you being there, you shouldn't be there. And you've got private hire work, which is the act of an operator sending somebody to do a job, pick up in one area, maybe travel through 5 or 6 different regions, drop off at the final area, and then to come back. Well, that's perfectly legal. That's pre-booked. There's nothing wrong with that. So, and cross-border working, which is pretty much another term for predominant out-of-area use. They are intentionally working in the remote region at all times with no intention of returning back to their home issuing authority. But as has been touched on already, with the introduction and discussions of devolution as it's coming through, those regions will become a lot larger. So it won't be a smaller local authority that is a local district. It will become an entire zone, the whole of Greater Manchester, for example, the whole of West Lancashire, the whole of East Lancashire. So instead of being narrowed down into a small area, you'll have a much larger area where you are able to work. So I think action does need to be taken, and it needs to be taken quite urgently to address this and to take action. I think the intended use policy would work. I think enforcement of the Section 75(1)A would work, geofencing would work, but what we are seeing is a massive lack of enforcement, because you've got the triple lock rule. If you've got a Manchester operator that has got Merseyside, Knowsley, Sefton, various other local authority licensed drivers and vehicles on their records, they are in breach. If those jobs have been dispatched to a vehicle and driver that is not licensed by the same local authority, that is a clear breach of the triple lock rule. So there needs to be more enforcement. A lot of councils are very good at it. They do go into offices, they do check it, and they do take action. But what we're seeing is the excuse of, we have limited resources. Who's going to pay for it? Because it can't be the local licensees that are paying for enforcement of like vehicles and drivers that are licensed and paid their fees to a different authority. So maybe we need to be looking at centralising funding for enforcement. National standards, I agree. We've been campaigning for national standards for a long time, but we do need to be very mindful of the differences, clear differences between the likes of Transport for London versus Monmouthshire in Wales. The two don't mix, so there has to be that regional variation. But I do believe that where you've got sections 47, 57 and 67 of the LGMPA, which allows for local variations, the level of those variations is going to decrease because of devolution. But I do believe that there should be a strong justification for making those variations, and that has to be written. Thank you.
Ollie, yeah, just on the cross-border hiring, I think, you know, it is the practice of people licensing in one area and coming to another area to work. Now, the start and finish in the area that you're licensed is start or finish in the area you're licensed is a clear way of stopping. It doesn't put any parameters. We can have exemptions for special education needs, for patient transfers, for specialised chauffeur services. At the current model, a driver can get a job from A to B, B to C, C to D, could end up in London from Liverpool. He's still got to come back to Liverpool because that's where he lives. So the fact that all that dead mileage, he's still going to have dead mileage because you've got to come back. If you understand, there's that sort of clear. Probably 90% of jobs issued by local operators are for local people travelling locally. I've been a cab driver for 28 years. I've had very few, let's say, lucrative jobs that take me far from where I live. Most of the work I do is in my local area. So again, United's stance is keep it local, keep it safe. We have a campaign called the Get Home Safely campaign, and this is to get employers to help their nighttime economy staff get home. A lot of them are not engaging in it because they don't know who they're getting. The Tory government or the Conservative government brought out the legislation, the Deregulation Act in 2015. That's been abused. It gives the powers for operators to transfer a job to another operator for them to complete that journey. In the case of a breakdown or an emergency, they could dispatch that job to another operator in Birmingham. They would do that job and complete it and be paid. If we look at it statistically, it's quite horrific the way the 2015 Deregulation Act has been abused.
And then I'll come back to David.
Again, differing views. Chauffeur and school got the same views with you there. They should be looked at in a slightly different way. It would cost an absolute fortune for the government if it couldn't have out of area schools. Chauffeurs have got to have out of area. I have a client that would go from here to Scotland and 4 or 5 days later go from Scotland to maybe Northumberland and want the same chauffeur. There's no borders in this country, and I wonder why.
Anyway.
I'm really concerned about the time because I do want to give the second panel.
I'm sorry, but I understand that. But there are no borders in this country, and I think it's really important that taxis and private hire are licensed as private hire, shouldn't be tied to a local area. They should be able to go where they want. They have a licence, much the same as an electrician, a train driver, a bus driver, a solicitor. They can work wherever they wish to work and wherever they need to work. And as long as there's a national standard, there should be no problems with that.
Right. Anything to add on triple lock? Did you want to push anything else on triple lock, or do we think the witnesses have all more or less covered triple lock?
Well, I think we're in the rapid fire part of the panel. And we've already heard from Mr. Laurie and other witnesses that enforcement is an issue with the triple lock. And please don't, if you feel that you've covered this question already, but are there other areas where you would like to see the operation of the triple lock improved?
Yeah. Lawrence, yeah. We're fully, I think we're all supportive of national enforcement powers for all licensing authorities, so they can issue fixed penalties, issue suspensions, regardless of where that vehicle is licensed, if it's plying its trade in the authority that it is caught to be defective or a misdemeanor. At the moment, they are having to contact licensing officers from that particular licensing authority for them to suspend it. And again, it is, for Unite's point of view, and I think a lot of my colleagues along the bench, it is putting the travelling public at risk on a daily and a weekly basis. So if anything else, national enforcement powers going forward, if we're going to sort the professionalism of the taxi and private hire trade, accredited training and standards, close the cross-border hiding loop, and give national enforcement powers to licensing officers.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Andy.
Thank you. With medical standards all being the same, DBS interpretation, which is really, really, really important, it's interpreted differently right the way through the country. Safeguarding training, vehicle standards, enforcement training, all being the same, is there a need for a triple lock? And I would say there's not.
Thank you. One final question from me. We've talked almost exclusively about drivers in terms of the workforce. I just wondered whether any of the panellists wanted to add comments about non-drivers who are also involved in the trade, such as dispatch operators, local authority officers, and any wellbeing or paying conditions issues that you wish to draw to our attention.
I think that there needs to be the rollout and development of far more active engagement, as we've seen with the 2014 Act, which stated that the Regulators Code, the Regulators Code 2014, there needs to be far more active engagement and working groups, and the trade needs to be recognised for the professional bodies that they actually are. When we look around, we see the Liverpool example with the bombing where the driver recognised it. The trade is a highly professional body. The licensing authorities are in the main highly professional, but there seems to be that breakdown in communication between the two. And I think if we can improve on that, then we can improve on standards, we can improve on enforcement, we can improve on the activity and checking on the triple lock rule, we can improve on the unlawful private hire vehicles parking on ranks, etc., etc. We need to be very mindful here that this cross-border issue and the abuse or ignoring of the triple lock rule did not start in 2015. It started in 2007 in Berwick. Then it was predominantly hackney carriage. Since then it has rolled out onto private hire. But because hackney carriages are vastly outnumbered by private hire throughout the UK, it is far more a recognisable problem now. But it isn't because of the 2015 Act.
Honestly, yeah, just on that, I think we've lost the professionalism in our opinion, and we need to get it back. And anybody who is involved in the private hire or taxi industry should go through the same rigorous checks than what a driver does. Who's to say, an operator or somebody who works for an operator isn't unscrupulous, or they need to have the same background checks as what the drivers do. They are issuing the jobs, they are accepting the jobs, they are taking the money predominantly.
As a public sector union as well, GB is quite conscious of the pressures that local councils face, and it is a significant issue that we have challenges at local government level around funding on many areas, let alone just for their statutory responsibilities. There is I think there is some potential for the economies of scale if there is to be sort of slightly enhanced transport authorities. The combination of authorities pooling resources may well, in an ideal world, meet the consistency that we're looking to see from authorities, and that's provision of service that's timely, that's efficient, but also effective as well, because I think it's not just about being efficient, it is about effectiveness for our drivers to be able to be receiving service, and also operators and riders as well. And perhaps that's another future benefit of a reformed transporting arrangements.
Employment status.
Well, there was a question earlier about the Supreme Court judgment, which I think has been covered in respect of Uber. And again, I'm very conscious of time, but what is the situation for other operators in terms of employee-worker status? And it'd be interesting to hear particularly about small operators.
Well, this was actually touched on a few moments ago with the reference to contract. Who is the contract with? So the 2021 Employment Bill, in our opinion, was legally flawed in two senses. Part one was the driver may not be involved in the acceptance of bookings. No, they can't. That's the 76 Act. It's a private hire driver. The second part was the private hire driver may not be involved in the setting of the fares. No, you're quite right. The 76 Act states that the fares must be set by the operator. The only part that was right was specifically to Uber, because in the Uber model, Uber takes payment for all fares. They then pay the driver, and that's what made the drivers, gave the drivers the worker status. That model doesn't roll out onto the generic industry as a whole. And we saw this recently challenged in the Session case with Session versus Delta and Viju, where Uber appealed against the decision and it went to the final hearing, and Uber lost their appeal because the generic taxi and private hire models does not work in the same way. There has always been a multitude of contracts. When a passenger contacts an operator, they request a trip, find out what the journey is, and are accepted. That is offer, consideration, acceptance. There's your first contract. The operator then passes the job onto the driver, who is contracted to provide a service on behalf of the operator and take that passenger safely from A to B and charge them the rate that has been set by the operator. That is your second contract. Once that driver turns up, if he turns up on a skateboard and your passenger's not going to get on, there is not the third contract. If the driver turns up and the passenger stood there with a string vest on, blood hanging down from him, vomit all over him, and 15 bags of luggage, they're not going to let them get in the vehicle, and there is not the third contract. But if everything's fine, the vehicle's professional, the driver's professional, everything's okay about it, and the passenger gets in, you then have the third contract between the passenger and the driver. The difficulty is, under the 2015 Devolution Act, there is the possibility of multiple contracts coming into play along the line, as Paul's already suggested, that an operator can subcontract to a different operator in a different district. So within any one journey, you could actually have up to 8, 9, 10 contracts in play at any given time. The issue is who takes the payment, and that was the case of the 2021 employment case. Who takes the payment? The operator does, therefore the driver is a worker and entitled to pay. The negative side of that is the reaction from the industry, the drivers as a whole, because they've seen that their rate per mile has dropped as a direct result of the 21 case. Massively dropped. Because Uber are now having to cover the holiday pay, the sick pay, and that comes out of fares.
I wonder if I might bring in Mr. O'Hearn first to respond as a GMB representative.
You've left a great curly question for the last one, because the crossover between VAT decisions at tribunal, where there are decisions that support both models of operation are quite clear and quite well known. The Uber decision was about control and employment status. Uber made the decision, and they can speak for themselves, but they made the decision to change their business model post Supreme Court decision. I think the challenge around that model, if you like, and the challenge around all of it is, again, where does that leave the driver? And Paul's absolutely right. There are, different operating models out there, and perhaps this is where government colleagues who are involved in discussions around a new or potentially new VAT regime for the industry probably should liaise closely with this committee, because there's an opportunity to establish a consistent VAT regime that treats passengers and operators fairly, We have a massive concern at the moment in that Bolt has lost an employment tribunal decision on the status of its drivers. It is appealing that decision, understandably, but HMRC is allowing Bolt to argue at the financial tribunals on their VAT dispute that Bolt's drivers are independent contractors. HMRC has not challenged Bolt on that position, not challenged Bolt that it has an employment tribunal decision to the contrary. And so we have this third mix and issue coming in which is not helpful and not, I think, cognizant of departments being on the same page, because if the government continues to ignore that tribunal decision, employment tribunal, Bolt's free to argue its VAT arrangements are consistent with independent contractors, which we don't believe is the case, and we think that the tribunal decision for Bolt is absolutely clear-cut based on the tribunal or the Supreme Court decision regarding Uber.
I'm conscious of time. I had seen Mr. James indicate.
Yeah, going back to your earlier question about the smaller operators, what we're finding now is the smaller operators in the big cities are getting swamped out. They're no longer your traditional small urban area operators, because it's the if you can't beat them, join them model. So the bigger operators in that area, for Liverpool, like Delta and Alpha, and now got licensing operators licenses in all the cities, including Wolverhampton, Birmingham and everywhere else. So your traditional, what you would say your secure operator, has gone out of business because they just swamp them, because they lower the prices, they basically bully them out of existence. And that, again, has a massive effect on the local communities, and certainly the elderly and the people who are vulnerable, because they're used to having that local operator. So the whole system is now being imploded by A, the platform-based operators, and B, the larger national, what we would call traditional operators, taking over all the smaller operators, and that's the big thing that we found, certainly in Greater Manchester and the City region, and even in TfL in London.
Yeah. And then in rural areas, you've got a lot of one-person operators, one driver, one car, self-employed effectively. Yeah. I'm very conscious of the time, and you've all given very effusive answers which have sort of covered the answers to other questions. Do any of my colleagues have anything they feel they really want to still ask? I'm going to have to move on to the next panel now. I do apologise, but I'd like to thank you for your evidence today and the time you spent with your submissions. If there's anything you feel needs to still be added, please do write in. I'm going to suspend the session for a few moments so that our next witnesses can take their places at the table. The sitting is suspended.